and welcome to our social psychology lecture. Social psychology uses scientific methods to understand as well as explain how thoughts, feelings, and behavior of individuals are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied the presence of other human beings. Essentially, social psychology is about understanding how each person's individual behavior is influenced by the social environment in which that behavior takes place. Attitudes. You can acquire an attitude through learning. Social cognition studies how we think about ourselves as well as how we think of others. Attitudes are formed through physical conditioning, which would be situations condition us to have a specific response to something. We can also learn through operant conditioning, where reinforcers and punishers to establish and solidify attitudes over time. We can also learn observational conditioning, so acquiring attitudes of a significant role model or parent or someone we look up to. Attitudes are better predictors of behavior when they are certain and low of ambivalence, both positive or negative in terms of cognition or affective aspects. Quickly and automatically retrieved from our long-term memory, learn through direct experience with the attitude object, are stable over time, associate themselves with a mood, and at the same level of attitude relevant action activity. Attitude changes, right? Attitudes can change over time, and one way is cognitive consistency. And this is avoiding contradictions in attitudes and behaviors, or the cognitive disorient theory. And this is inconsistencies among attitudes or between attitudes and behavior that causes sort of an unpleasant physical state. Remove inconsistencies causing this disorder by changing behavior, changing the attitude, removing this inconsistency by bringing in new beliefs to the situation. In persuasion, which is an attempt to change another person's attitude. Forming an impression. Impression formation is the process we use to understand and judge others. Attributions explains, you know, basically a given behavior's cause, why the behavior is happening. We can make attributions about others or our own behavior. There's trait attribution, which is the cause of behavior based on characteristics of a person being judged. Situational attributions, which is the cause of behavior based on characteristics of the environment in which that behavior happened or occurred. There's fundamental attribution error or correspondence bias, which is relying on trait attributions in sort of discounting the situational explanation or behavior. And those are often caused by a lack of information about the environment, the social setting in which we view the person and their behavior, individual cultures result reduced by practicing mindfulness and being aware of our own potential bias. Stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice. Now, a stereotype is basically a thought or a perception about a given group of people. They can be negative and they can be positive. It doesn't necessarily have to be negative to be considered a stereotype. Prejudice, on the other hand, is a negative stereotype applied to every group member that you're speaking of. It's very limited evidence to actually support any sort of prejudice. They're often untrue. Um, and it really ignores the differences between people in a group. When it comes to discrimination, this is a different treatment due to having a prejudiced attitude. And there's also sort of aversive racism, which is an outward support of being equal and being fair, but negative emotions occur in the presence of that minority or person of color. The bystander effect. Now, this is a really interesting effect when it comes to psychology. The more witnesses that are at an emergency, the less likely anyone is to actually offer help. The potential causes for bystander effect is diffusion of responsibility. This is the idea that all bystanders share equally in the responsibility for helping in an emergency. So they're not helping, I'm not helping. Pluralistic um, ignorance, which is the failure of a group to perceive that the problem actually requires any help. I just don't see it as a group. We don't see it. And that can cause, chaos, right? And this doesn't apply to everyone, of course, as, you see these medical emergencies or active shooter situations. There's a couple people that run towards the fire, but most of the people are running away from it. So that's all part of that bystander effect. You see someone running, you start running. And you think, I can't help. There's no way for me to be of service here. I don't know anything, so I'm leaving. Or you may be able to help, but just feel like, well, no one else is helping, so it's not my responsibility. The Ash experiment. So Solomon Ash and others have found that people are more likely to adjust their behavior or thinking to sort of agree with a group standard in the following circumstances. They feel insecure or incompetent or just uneducated on the topic. Their group has at least three people in it. Everyone else has already agreed. They admire the group's status or attractiveness. They have not already committed to another response, and they know they are being observed. Their culture encourages respect for social standards. So these are sort of in general what we've come up with. Think about being on a jury and that one person that's holding out, they would be an exception to the rule, not the rule. Most of the time, especially in juries, if six people have said yes, the seventh person is going to say yes because they're like, well, I might be wrong, right? So that's sort of what this experiment was looking at. And in this experiment, seven men sat around a table and were asked to make a series of 18 line comparison judgments. Six of the men were Confederates of the experimenter, and one was the subject. The correct answer was always apparent in all 18 tasks, very clear as day. There was no real question here about which one was right. And the subject, or the naive subject, was always the sixth of the seventh subjects to make his judgment. On the first two trials, all seven of the men chose the correct line. But the remaining 12 of 16 trials, all of the Confederates chose incorrectly. They intentionally picked the wrong one. Subjects would show signs of strain, double checking, uncertainty, questioning themselves, all but one in the three subjects adjusted their responses to match the incorrect judgments of the Confederates in half or more than 12 conformity trials. Only 25% of the subjects completely resisted that group pressure. They knew the line. So 75% of them knew that the exact line, they knew which one was right, but still went with what everyone else said, even though they can see, they know this is not right. They went with it because everybody else did. Pretty interesting. The last is the Milgram's experiment. Stanley Milgram did obedience studies. They were conducted on an all male subject at Yale University in the early 1960s, and subjects were told that they were participating in study of effects of punishment on learning. Deception was used. There was no actual punishment here, but the subjects didn't know that. The subject would administer shocks each time the learner gave the wrong answer to a problem. The shock level in the study ranged from 15 volts to 450 volts. The experimenter gave the teacher a test shock of 45 volts so that he would know how the shock would feel. Each time the learner makes a mistake, a shock is received, which then increased by 15 volts on every additional mistake. As the experiment begins, the learner makes some mistakes and the teacher administers the shock as instructed by the experimenter. At 120 volts, the learner cries out that the shock really hurts. As the learner continues to make mistakes, he protests, saying that he has a heart condition and he refuses to continue with this experiment, demanding to be let out of this chair. At 330-volt shock, he fails to respond with any protest. The teacher would turn to the experimenter to see what to do, and the experimenter would say to treat no response as an incorrect response and continue with the experiment. Despite the fact that all subjects were volunteered, paid in advance, and obviously very stressed, only a minority failed to exhibit total obedience. Almost two of every three participants, so about 65%, continued to obey the experimenter and administered the maximum possible shot of 450 volts. Obedience was highest when the person giving the orders was nearby or was perceived as a legitimate authority figure. The research was supported by prestigious institutions. The victim was depersonalized or at a distance, and there were no role models for any sort of defiance or anything like that. So again, another interesting experiment. Hope you guys enjoyed the lecture.